Okay, YouTube, this is Chad Hightower from Campbell, South Carolina, and we're going to move right along with Go Devil build today. And I'm going to try to include 2 or 3 steps in this video. I know where we ended the last video, we had set the thrust up and the main bearings, set the thrust on the camshaft, and we checked the tolerances on the main bearings. So I'm going to start this video with just to let you know, I've already installed the rear main oil seal, and we're going to move right into crankshaft thrust, and it's just going to be, you know, nothing to it because I've already got everything set up. So then we'll move into ring gap and possibly start on the clearances for the rods today. So we'll just kind of see how all this plays out. So stand by while I get the camera ready, and we'll move right into forward thrust. So stand by. Okay, so you can kind of see what we got set up here. So I've got the old crankshaft gear installed, and I have it torqued down to the new crankshaft gear, and I'm just using the old crankshaft gear as a spacer so that I can maintain tension on the thrust bearing. So let me see if I can zoom in a little bit so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Alright, so this area right in here is the thrust bearing. And if you'll go back and look at the previous videos, you can kind of take a look at that bearing and see how it's different than the other bearings. And it has a face on it on both sides, so that when you depress the clutch on this vehicle, it has a tendency to want to push the crankshaft forward. When you press down on the throttle and raise the RPMs under the engine, the crankshaft and the camshaft both want to slide out of the engine. Usually they'll move in a forward position. But this thrust bearing controls the amount of thrust and keeps the crankshaft in place, and maintains the forward thrust in order to control the movement of the crankshaft. So you can see right here, you know, I've got the dial indicator set up, and I'm going to measure the amount of forward thrust or lateral thrust on this thing. Let me get you dialed in here on the dial indicator so you can see what's happening. Alright, so the specification in the TM is 3 to 7 thousandths. So we got to be within that window in order for this engine to be okay to run. So I'm just going to take a pry bar, and I'm going to pry on the back side of the crankshaft until my needle comes to rest. So we are at almost 5 thousandths. So we'll move the crankshaft back and repeat the test again just to confirm. Okay, so we'll pry forward again, and we are at 5 thousandths. So we are definitely within specifications on the forward thrust, and I'm perfectly okay with that. So we'll move on to ring fit and start fitting the rod bearings too. So I don't know if I can get all that on one video, but we'll give it a shot. So stand by for the next shot. Okay, so what I've got set up here is, here's the ring arrangement for the #1 cylinder here. Now I have a total of 6 pieces here. And you know, obviously if you understand how engines work, then you might want to move on, but this is for some of my family who, you know, is very interested in some of this stuff. So I'm just going to kind of explain what's going on here. So here's the top compression ring, and you'll see how all this fits together and how it works. Here's the second. It's a little bit different. It has a chamfer on the inside here. Here's the oil rings and the expander ring. So all 6 of these components have to fit on the piston in these grooves right here. And it's important to know that these rings have to fit on the grooves of the piston, but they also have to fit the cylinder bore. And there has to be a certain amount of gap in between each one of the rings when it's installed. Now the specification for that is on the low side 8 thousandths and on the high side 13. Okay, so I'm not worried about the high side, I'm worried about the low side, because here's what's going to happen. When you build an engine or machine an engine, you have to understand that when you're machining this engine sometimes to a tolerance as if the engine were at temperature. So what will happen when these rings get hot is they'll start to expand. And if you don't have the proper amount of gap in between the ring and the piston, and the ring expands, it will shatter the ring inside the piston groove. And sometimes it'll damage the cylinder bore, but it will ultimately allow exhaust gases to pass through that ring down into the crankcase and losing horsepower. So we want to make sure that we get these ring gaps set right so that when we put them on the piston and install everything in the engine, when the engine starts up and runs and gets up to temperature, when these things expand, they have room to expand instead of, breaking into pieces. So we'll just demonstrate one cylinder here, and I'll do the other 3 offline, off camera, so that you kind of get the idea of how this works. What I'm talking about here. Now I'm going to leave this one kind of high so you can kind of see what's going on here. Let me see if I can zoom in just
okay, so
I moved the rod over here on the other, the ring over here on the other side of the piston, and I've left it kind of high in the block just so we can demonstrate here. But if you look real close, you could see a gap right here. So there's the gap, nice and close. So when this ring gets hot, it's going to expand, and when it expands, it's going to close this gap up. And we want to give plenty of room for this ring to expand, because this is where our horsepower is developed. This is where we convert fuel into energy. So we want to make sure that we don't set this gap to a point to where it damages that fuel robbing process. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a 8 thousandths feeler gauge here and see if it slips in between the ring. Alright, so 8 thousandths is our low side, and just for get kicks, let's see if a 13 slides. 13 does not slide, so let's move down to an 11. Alright, so here's an 11, and the 11 fits. So we're 8 thousandths. It definitely falls within the specifications. Then we'll come in here with our top ring. We'll fit it into the bore and go in with our 8 thousandths gauge, and it slips and fits. Let me see if I can get you a shot of that, how that slips down in there. I don't know if you can see that or not, but that definitely. Okay, so we're going to start here with number 3, and a couple of checks we need to do here. So we've already fit our rings to our cylinder. and we know that our ring gap is within specifications. So what I normally like to do is take all three of the rings and start with the top compression ring, and make sure that obviously these are the right rings for the piston. And what I do is just slide the ring in on the top groove there, and see if I can get you in a little bit close here. And what I'm looking for is that this area right in here where the screwdriver points, I want to make sure that that ring does not protrude as I roll it around the piston here. Because one time I got a set of oversized rings in the wrong box, and luckily I caught it, but I always check from this point forward to make sure that, hey, that's correct. Okay, so, and we'll check all three of these and make sure they're good to go, and the two oil rings here as well, and those definitely are okay. So I'll take a black Sharpie here, and I'll mark the end of the expansion ring, or the oil control expansion ring, and we'll slide this over the piston like so. Then I'll take my oil ring, and I'm just going to kind of spiral these down just a little bit until I get it into the bottom of the expansion ring, just like so. Now I've marked my expansion ring in black ink here, so I know that I want my bottom ring, or the gap, to be a good 90 degrees away from that. So I'm just going to rotate my bottom ring so that the gap is away from this area, and when I install the next ring, I'll make sure that the gap is 90 degrees from the expansion gap. Now, like I said earlier, you can't have any of these gaps line up, because when the combustion process takes place, if they are lined up, then they will leak gas into the combustion chamber, which loses power and causes some big issues. Okay, so there's the bottom oil control rings. Now we're going to take the number 2 ring, we're going to slide it up, and it goes in the number 2 spot. And then I'm going to rotate that ring, that gap, away from the oil gaps. Then I'm going to take the top ring and install it and rotate it as well. Okay, so there's the piston ring installation, and we'll do all 4 of these off camera, or all the next 3, and we'll move on to the next step. So stand by.